Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 700 Club. Thank you for joining us today. A ceasefire between Israel and Hamas has ended the heaviest fighting since 2014. So why are the Palestinians claiming victory in the name of a new Palestine? And why do most Israelis say the ceasefire came too soon? Chris Mitchell brings us this look at the aftermath of the brutal battle and what comes next.
In 11 days, Hamas fired more than 4,000 rockets into south and central Israel that sent millions of Israelis running for shelter. In response, Israel launched a massive and surgical bombing campaign to stop those rockets. Despite devastating damage to its military infrastructure, Hamas and its supporters took to the streets and declared victory.
Netanyahu, the Zionist enemy, and his army said that they would destroy the tunnels above our resistance. And I tell him today that our fighters are now striding proudly in the tunnels.
Iran supplied many of the rockets to Hamas, and in Tehran, the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard boasted a new Palestine has emerged. In a live address, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told the nation,
"The only thing that leads me in making decisions is the security and safety of the Israeli people. If there was a need to enter Gaza with ground troops, we would have done it, but I believed we could accomplish our goals without doing so."
U.S. President Joe Biden pressured Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to stop the fighting.
I commended him for the decision to bring the current hostilities to a close within less than 11 days. I also emphasize what I've said throughout this conflict. The United States fully supports Israel's right to defend itself.
Yet in Israel, nearly three-quarters of Israelis felt the ceasefire came too soon, without eliminating Hamas's ability to wage war. Hamas's charter calls for the destruction of Israel, and Islamic expert Dr. Mordecai Kadar told CBN News that for Hamas, the 11-day conflict was a jihad, a holy war, and Israel was on the front lines. Kadar says while the West may look on this as a ceasefire, Hamas sees this through the eyes of the Arabic concept of hudna.
Means a temporary ceasefire, which is used by the jihadists in order not to start a course of peace, but in order to regain his power, in order to have a better jihad in the next phase.
Israeli leaders now go back to trying to form a government. Even though most Israelis felt the war ended too soon, many approve of how Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu handled the crisis. So he may yet survive the challenge to his leadership. And it's possible Israelis will also end up heading to the polls once again, the fifth time in just more than 2 years. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
So the term being used is temporary ceasefire. Let's not stop praying for Israel at this point, feeling like somehow this has all been quelled. I mean, it's a temporary ceasefire, and on top of that, there's so much confusion politically. It's an opportunity for us to pray, to ask God to intervene in the midst of all of this, to see change, to see peace come to Jerusalem. Well, here at home, Republicans strongly supported Israel during its fight with Hamas, but many of them on Capitol Hill are growing concerned about the weakening Democratic support for the Jewish state. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Thanks, Terry. For decades, the Democratic Party has been a champion of Israel, but the party's support has begun to erode in recent years. Several Republican senators criticized congressional Democrats this week for a lack of support for Israel during the fight with Hamas. In the meantime, some Democrats are taking a stand against the Jewish state. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson has that story.
Lawmakers here have historically been unified in their support for Israel. Now, Republicans say they're concerned with the growth of anti-Israel rhetoric from their Democratic colleagues.
Israel's a democracy. Hamas is a terrorist group.
But not all lawmakers agree.
Well, I think the Squad used to be a fringe element of the Democratic Party when it comes to Israel. Probably still are. But more and more Democrats like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Chris Murphy are openly siding with this moral equivalency argument that there's problems on both sides.
Senator Lindsey Graham tells CBN News he's shocked by the number of Democrats reluctant to firmly stand with Israel.
When the Iranians and Hamas here, Democratic members of Congress and the Senate, basically seeing no difference between Israel and Hamas, it only incentivized more violence.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell adds when it comes to Israel and Hamas, they play by very different rules.
When Israel strikes, for example, they call the building and say, please get out of the building because we're about to attack it in order to minimize civilian casualties. Hamas is lobbing rockets into Israel to kill civilians. There is no moral equivalency here.
Both senators support Israel defending itself. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who has Palestinian relatives in the West Bank, confronted President Biden Tuesday in Michigan over his support for Israel, reportedly sharing a message similar to her recent House speech.
As long as the message from Washington is that our military support for Israel is unconditional, Netanyahu's extremism, right-wing government will continue to expand settlements, continue to demolish homes, and continue to make the prospects for peace impossible.
The White House announced Wednesday President Biden spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu.
The president conveyed to the Prime Minister that he expected a significant de-escalation today on the path to a ceasefire.
Graham described Biden's Israel response as uneven and also criticized his plans to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal.
Why would you go back into a nuclear deal with the largest state sponsor of terrorism?
Pointing to Iran's role in the current attacks on Israel.
Without Iran's support for Hamas, there would be no 3,500 rockets.
As the situation continues in Israel, Senate Republicans agreed that until Hamas stops targeting Israeli civilians, there should be no ceasefire. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Abigail. While Islamic groups from Gaza fired rockets in Israel in recent days, another battle took place online when Islamic groups attacked one of the largest Christian pages on Facebook that brought millions of Christians together to pray for Israel and the peace of Jerusalem. Here again, Chris Mitchell from Jerusalem.
The Jerusalem Prayer Team, established nearly 20 years ago with a reported nearly 77 million followers on Facebook, saw it suddenly shut down. Mike Evans tells CBN News an anti-Semitic campaign of hate targeted the Facebook page.
An organized Islamic campaign coming out of Pakistan, Indonesia, and Turkey targeted our site with over 1 million comments. So Facebook, rather than contact Bible believers and find out the truth, they responded to radical Islamic 911 would-bes and pulled us down.
The cyber campaign happened in the middle of the team's prayer time during the conflict between Hamas and Israel.
We've been praying for peace. We've been praying for God to protect Israel. We've been praying for peace in Jerusalem. We've been praying for blessing over the Jewish people, protection over the Jewish people. We've been praying for protection over Arab Israelis.
The attack campaign was twofold. First came the negative Facebook comments.
People coming from anti-Semitic groups calling for a second Holocaust, people attacking us personally, people making threats upon us personally.
Second, the hackers spread a false narrative that Facebook created the page during the conflict and then had people like the page without their consent. Dozens of videos with thousands of views across social platforms celebrated the news that the prayer team's page was down. Al Jazeera also reported on the situation.
I'm incredibly disappointed right now, basically, that instead of these anti-Semitic people who are attacking Christians for praying for peace in Jerusalem, for praying for peace, an end of the bloodshed, and instead of stopping those anti-Semitic attacks against us, Facebook has shut our page down.
The Jerusalem Prayer Team is appealing the decision, and Evans has enlisted the help of U.S. and Israeli leaders. CBN News reached out to Facebook, and they provided us with this statement. We removed Jerusalem Prayer Team's Facebook page for violating our rules against spam and inauthentic behavior.
My prayer right now is that Facebook would start to act with, hopefully, integrity on the situation and restore our prayers. You know, in this era, the fact that your prayers could be canceled on the internet is an unimaginable thing.
Evans came to Israel to report from the front lines of the conflict as part of a television special that includes many Christian leaders.
But it's to bring solidarity for the state of Israel and to oppose the lies to the evangelicals of the world.
Evans sees the special as an effort to win the media war and counter what he says is the mainstream media believing the lies of radical Islam. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thanks, Chris. Terry, it's stunning to think that a page or a group of people praying for peace would be shut down.
That's really true, John, but it's not the first time that we have seen conservative or Christian messages shut down or taken off, even temporarily. You know, it's unfortunate because many of us enjoy being able to follow family pictures, family information on Facebook, but this is one of the things that happens when you allow monopolies to exist.